This week, we'll be discussing the clashes that occur with the monarchy and the struggles that occur over the ways in which sort of new ideas confronted and combated those institutions and those long-held privileges by different groups of people. So one of the big things that occurs, and this was sort of part of what was in the assignments for last week, is the Enlightenment really changes the way people viewed their reaction to and their participation in the government, right? There emerged in the middle of the 18th century feelings where the government, and particularly the idea of the king, could no longer just with a blanket statement make rules and make laws that impacted everybody. And as a result of that, what occurs is a massive shift in the way people sort of take the rules and the laws that change within different societies. So we're going to be looking at today two places, the first of which will be France, and the second of which will be the Austrian Empire in the mid 1700s. So let me just start by sort of bringing this in, right? Throughout particularly the 1600s and into the 1700s, but even earlier than that, there had emerged this idea of absolute rule, absolute monarchy within Europe. And there was a belief, at least among some kings, this is not true for Britain per se, but this would be true for a place like France, for Austria, for the Austrian Empire, the Prussian Empire, right? That whatever the king said went, and the king sort of had to put on this almost performance of lavishness, of greatness that would emerge and sort of keep their prestige. Now, when this is occurring, right, everybody sort of, or at least the thought is that everybody's going to respect the king because they are the king and they're God's chosen person, and God then, because God has chosen this person, they can make any rule possible, right? But that gets confronted in the mid 1700s, and that's where these clashes come in. So when we look at France in the 1700s, right, from about the mid 1400s up through the late 1700s, there were, so for about 350 years, there existed what were called parlements. Parlements, right? Parliaments, right? They come from the same root as the English, British Parliament. However, they operate differently, right? Where the Parliament in Britain is the major institution, right? The major legal institution, legislative institution. That would not be the case here. Parliaments in this area, you might want to think of as more like local governments, local leadership. So by the late 1700s, so the first Parliament was created I'm just going to say it in the English way, in the 1450s in Paris. That was the oldest and the most powerful. But down here in the South, there was the most recent addition in the Parlement des Arcs. Now, these are local governments, right? So they make local laws. And more importantly, when a king makes a law, they had the ability and they had the right to petition or to confront what decisions and laws the king had promulgated. Now, that the king may or may not listen to it, the king may or may not care about it, but they were able to do so. Now, what that also means is that you have local leadership that can get more powerful and can become more prominent, right? So in the French Revolution, we're going to talk about a guy named Maximilien Robespierre. Well, Robespierre is a lawyer and small-time politician, out in Arras, up in the northern portions of Paris, right? And when we talk about different leadership out in the different provinces, that's what we're going to be discussing here. Now, so when we think about absolutism and we think about this sort of almighty power coming from the king, right? That is true. However, it's important to realize that it's not just as if the king says something and thus it goes, right? There are checks on the king's authority. But nonetheless, the king, again, has to put on this sort of performance of grandeur, right? So one of the things that Louis XIV, the king from 1643 up until 1715, is that he produces he turns a small camping hunting lodge of his grandfather's into the Palace of Versailles. Now, Versailles is really just supposed to show the lavishness and the greatness of the king, right? It is just opulent and splendid. So there's a lot of gilded gold. There's a lot of mirrors to reflect and show the greatness, right? This is the sort of inner. So when you arrived, this is the hallway, and that you would come into. This is like the front door, if you will. Again, it sort of like embraces you and hugs you. The front of the building, if you stood on the far edge of it and walked to the other edge of it, it was a third of a mile long. It was just a huge building. There were over 2,500 rooms at the palace. Now, there was obviously the building of the palace, but then there was also the buildings around the palace. So that would have accounted for the 2,500 rooms. Nobles were required to spend a portion of their year in Versailles, being close to the king. But what this also meant is that this is an extremely expensive place to operate. So this was, I sometimes compare this to like living on a cruise. There was a show every night. There was dinner. All of your meals were provided by the monarch. There was always something to do. There were tennis courts and pools and orchards to walk around, and all of these different things that a person could do. So by the later half of the 18th century, the Palace of Versailles was costing nearly 50% of the annual budget just to operate. So there were archaic systems, right? There was the levee in the morning, where the king would wake up and nobles would be there to greet him, and there would be the putting to bed of the king in the evening, same sort of thing. There was dinners, and again, dinners and shows, all that. So it was really archaic, really just outdated and pretty awful. Now, so you have that on the one hand, right? The sort of operation of the state is costing a lot of money. You have this sort of provincial operations that are going on. But in the 18th century, there's also just a massive amount of debt that is going to be incurred around the globe. From the early 1700s up until really the culmination of the 7 Years' War in 1763, there was pretty much constant warfare going on, whether that's the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, different fights between different kingdoms, larger global wars such as the 7 Years' War, whatever the case indeed might be. There was just nearly constant warfare with just maybe some small truces speckled here and there. And these parliaments, these provincial parlements, would protest the increases in taxes that were being levied to pay for these wars. But you also have another growing level of criticism coming from the philosophes, right? These Enlightenment thinkers who were growing out of the government in different places, right? So the Enlightenment is sort of helping to spur along this criticism. Finally, by the end of the 7 Years' War, the government passes a tax on basically 1/20th, 5%, of your income from land ownership. Now, the problem with this is for large landholders, right? They could sort of absorb this more easily. For small landlords, that was not the case. And, there are smaller areas, right? So, I mean, Paris is a very prominent area, so that's not the case. But like Grenoble, Toulouse, and Rouen, right? If you look, Grenoble is here in the southeastern corner. Toulouse is in the south, and Rouen is up here in the northwest, right? So you're talking about provincial, so northwest, south, southeast, right? You have these sort of provincial areas starting to protest that tax. And people are starting to argue that this is infringing upon their rights. So there is an attempted reform. And a couple of these things come, again, in response to the passing of that tax and other events, right? So there's something called the Brittany Affair. So Brittany is in the northern portion of France, right? So this is Brittany up here as you get closer to Britain. That's the name. So the king, through his internal minister, the Duc d'Orléans, tries to pass a law to build roads, and the Parliament of Brittany says, no, we are not going to allow a central government to come in. So they push back, and this creates a situation where the local leadership starts to ask, those parliaments in the areas start to ask for representation in a super parliament, a bigger parliament for the group, for the nation, and they start to push back on that. And they create sort of an unauthorized one. The king doesn't officially sanction it at first until later. The other thing that comes here is there's judicial reform that emerges in the mid-1700s, where instead of judges being appointed by the king, judges must have some sort of experience. They receive a salary from the state. They do not receive fees from the people who are in front of them, right? Because if I can pay a higher fee, I might be more favorable in that outcome. So when we look at France in the mid-1700s, right, there is this attempted, there are these pushbacks that are occurring on the king. And that idea of absolutism is certainly starting to wane. Similar confrontation and clashes occur in the Habsburg Empire. So the Habsburgs emerge as a prominent family in the 1100s, but it's really by the 1400s that they are becoming much more powerful, and they ultimately become the leaders of the Austrian Empire. And from their central location in Vienna, they control, the textbook discusses or calls sort of the Habsburg monarchy sort of a large land-holding empire. And I think that's a good way to think of the Habsburgs by this point. And when you look at the map that's currently on the screen, right, you can see that there are these different kingdoms that are sort of attached to the Austrian Empire, right? So you have the Kingdom of Hungary, you have the Crown of Bohemia, you have Silesia as part of that. And there will be a war between Prussia and, there will actually be two wars between Prussia and Austria over that territory. There's Galicia over here in the northeast. There's Croatia. There's just all of these different areas. Now, another portion of this is that, there are parts that are not necessarily within the empire, but they owe allegiance to the king or the queen or the emperor or the empress. So like in Venetia, in Lombardy, right? These territories are not necessarily part of the empire, which is why they are not colored in on this map, but they owe allegiance to Vienna. And by the time we get to by the mid 1700s, there are a lot of nationalities here, right? I mean, so you have these sort of larger kingdoms in the bolded area, but you'll also see that there's sort of these smaller, there's Tyroleans, there are Carniola, there are Slovenians, there are all of these different groups of people lumped into this massive empire. And the Habsburgs, in their seat in Vienna, favoring Austrians because they are based in Vienna, which is in Austria, they are involved in a lot of wars, but they're dragging these different people into these fights. And that's what's being created, is a lot of hostility and a lot of tension with the Habsburgs because of this, with the Austrians because of this. And within these different kingdoms and within these different territories, there are different diets, diets, right? They're small, again, parliaments, ideas. And they are meeting, and they are sort of, again, writing back to Vienna and saying, we don't like these decisions. We do not like being left out of these different decisions and being taken advantage of. So this is creating a growing nationalism, and they're starting to push back against the sort of centrally located control coming out of Vienna. This will all come to a head, particularly when we get to the mid 1800s, and that'll be sort of the end of the class, where we talk about revolutions that occur in the 1840s and the different ways in which sort of these larger structures and these sort of archaic and antiquated structures start to be pushed back against, again, certainly the 1700s, by the 1800s.